Imagine your company's greatest story. A fearless narrative. An ambitious plot. A tale of innovation. With ideas so bold, great moments in time are born from its chapters. It's a story of fearless genius, passionate leaders, culture changers, revolutionaries who transform challenge into opportunity. Imagine its readers and the insight they discover on every page. It's a story about creativity and passion. One that motivates reflection and catalyzes action. It's an evolving tale, one whose ending is rewritten again and again, each even better than the last. Imagine your company's greatest story. It's a story worth sharing, right here, right now.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Hexagon President and CEO Ola Rollén.
Come with me now.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Good evening and welcome to Hexagon Live and a warm welcome to fabulous Las Vegas. As a matter of fact, you look so fabulous that I'm going to take a Eufy. Let's see if we can do this. Maybe wow, that's a lot of people. I think these lights are going to destroy it, but we'll see the results later on. So, this is the 4th consecutive time we're here in Las Vegas at the MGM. Has anyone been outside of the MGM? No? No, it's big enough to stay inside. But next year we're going to move this to Anaheim, so I thought we'd spend a little time looking at some statistics about Las Vegas. Do you know how many visitors there are in Las Vegas every year? I didn't hear you. Someone there is fairly close. 41.1 million. Do you know how big that is? Is Canada big? Canada is 35 millions, including Quebec. Some people debate that. Next statistics. How many convention delegates go to Las Vegas every year? 5.2 million. And that is roughly the size of Denmark, all right. Denmark is a little bigger, but more or less. And then we got other statistics. Las Vegas is not only famous for conventions and so on, it's famous for other things. So let's have a look at this. What is the average spending on gambling per visit? Do you have a clue on that? You're way too serious. I didn't even hear a number. Come on. Haven't you spent a single dime since you arrived? No. Well, the average is $280 per person and day, and that's the average. So a few of you out there are really dangerous people. And then we have other statistics. How many drinks are consumed each year in Las Vegas? 144 million. And the law of the averages actually goes here as well. So I've never seen anyone drink 3.5 drinks per day. So what's the truth? How many drinks are there really, and who is drinking the most? And then we have this never-ending question, does everything that happens in Vegas stay in Vegas? Well, we've consulted an expert on the subject, and his name is Alan. Alan is the guy to the left of this picture not wearing trousers. And we asked Alan, is it safe to do stupid things in Vegas? Does it really stay in Vegas? And he said, it's Sin City, I won't tell a soul. So we have some rules for this conference for the 4 days that we're going to be together, and the rules are really easy. We want you to spend less than $280. We want you to drink less than 3.5 drinks, that is per day. And no, don't even think about it. If Alan is your friend, don't go there. So we've reached the topic of this evening and the subject that we're going to discuss, which is human ingenuity. And you're just sitting there thinking about ways to escape the rules, aren't you? Well, that's not going to happen. So on a more serious note, human ingenuity is fantastic. If we look through this auditorium, this is an inexhaustible resource that we have today. You are so clever, and you will find out ways to do things that you didn't know was possible before you did it. And that is human ingenuity. So when I say human ingenuity, what do you think of? What's the first that comes to mind? But some people think about Uber or Uber, depending on what side of the Atlantic you are. Fantastic company, $40 billion market cap, the largest taxi company in the globe, and didn't exist 5 years ago. Some of you might think of Airbnb, similar business but in the hotel industry. Or Alibaba, with more than 80 million transactions per day. It's bigger than the biggest mall you could ever think of. But when we talk about ingenuity and human ingenuity, we want to up the game. We want to talk about the big questions. And we've done that in the past. We talk about the global megatrends, like pollution, population growth. We're going to grow from 7 to 9 billion people. How do we feed another 2 billion people on this planet? And these are really the questions that we should discuss here tonight and throughout the week. How can we enable mankind to resolve these problems? Because we got the power to do that. And to quote an old man, he's very old as a matter of fact, 2,400 years, and that was Plato. The necessity is the mother of invention. When we're pushed, when mankind is pushed, we develop. If we're pushed into a corner, we try to find a way to escape that corner. And that's really human ingenuity for me. So human progress is shaping the world. We come up with clever ideas, but how do we do it? How do we come up with these clever ideas? Well, some people say it's imagination versus knowledge. And I'm going to challenge Albert Einstein here tonight, because he said imagination is more important than knowledge. And I think he's wrong. If we look at this auditorium, how did you get here? You represent more than 60 nationalities. Plane, of course. So the flying machine is probably the most defining development we've done in the past 100 years. But how did we go about developing the airplane? Well, we all know that the Wright brothers flew, I think it was from over there to over there. And now they're forever in the history books. Doesn't look like much of a challenge, I think. But anyway, they developed the first flying machine. And it flew the 18 to 20 meters or whatever it did. But would that have been impossible without the previous knowledge and the ideas that people came up with during the centuries before? Now look at the picture to the left. That's Leonardo da Vinci, and he scribbled down that machine. He never built it, he never made it fly. but he was already on the idea how you create a flying machine. So I think it's fair to say it's imagination and knowledge in combination. That's what makes us tick. That's what makes us develop stuff and create all these beautiful things that we do. And at Hexagon we say that the shape of progress is information technology. Information technology, as we know it today, is a fairly young industry. It's 40, 50 years old. It started with these decoding machines during the World War II, and you might have seen this fantastic movie about that progress. But the way we describe it is the digital world versus the real world, and that's where Hexagon is unique. And if you think about it, the digital world, the way we know it today, is no different than our imagination. It's just that we got fancier tools than Leonardo da Vinci. I always have to think when I say Leonardo da Vinci because I'm about to say Leonardo DiCaprio. He didn't develop the stuff that da Vinci did. But so we got all these fancy tools. We can really create nice designs today. But what about the real world? How do we go about adjusting these designs so that they're actually consistent and they will work in the real world? Well, you can use our sensors, and we will sense to see if it works. We will follow up. And that, I believe, is the strength of this company for the future. So we basically believe in the movement moving away from isolated pieces of information, sort of point solution technologies, into something more comprehensive, like collaborative workflow processes, where you are enabled to share information across organizational boundaries, visualize problems with your colleagues, and use built-in intelligence like artificial intelligence. So Hexagon is shaping change, and we use information technologies to do so. We've come a long way in 2015, but let's discuss for a while the challenges and the bets we're going to do as an organization over the next 5 to 10 years. So I'm going to show you 5 trends that we're working on, which I think you will be able to see and use in the next 5 years. We'll start with the smart connected factory. Hexagon started its supplies to the engineering industries via metrology. We were basically quality controlling components and processes in manufacturing operations, anything from mobile phones to aircrafts. But what we believe for the future is that you need to connect robots, CNC machines with coordinate measurement machines and create a uniform information platform where everyone can share information and we can tell whether we produce scrap, whether we produce what we intended to produce, and we can lower cost for these products. The next theme we're working on is the intelligent management of the construction process. We're awfully good today. I'm bragging a bit, but SmartPlant is a great product, right? Of course. So we're really good at imagination, and we're really good at designing very complex factories. But how good are we at following up in the real world how these factory designs are deployed on the job site? And that's the next challenge for us, to connect the real world with the digital world using our sensors that we've developed over the past 30 years. To connect that back into SmartPlant so that a project leader can do dynamic project planning, and you can divide the financial responsibility between sub-suppliers and owner of projects. The third trend is really about society itself. When I was a kid, I grew up in the Cold War era, and we always believed that the enemy would come with aircraft carriers and submarines and use fighter jets to conquer our land. That might still happen today, and global tension, as you all know, is growing. But we have a new threat in society, and it's fairly new the way it's organized, and that is organized terrorism. We need to up the game. We need new tools. We need public safety and security forces to use different technologies to fight this new enemy from within. And one solution could be robotic intelligence, where you replace people with robots, especially in dangerous, repetitive, and mundane situations. The fourth development that we're looking at, and you're going to hear about it at Hexagon Geospatial later this week, is crowdsourced maps. We've launched something called the Hexagon Imagery Program, and we're launching a new product at Hexagon Geospatial during this venue. How much did you use maps 15, 20 years ago? Probably less than you do today. If you think of the latest development, you got smartphones, you want to know the nearest Starbucks or how to get to an address, and you're walking, you just look at your phone. We use Street View, we use Google Maps. People are using maps much more than they did in the past. And in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to require even better maps, more details, more precision, and more updates. And the only way to do that is we can't rely on a few professionals to collect the data. We need to have everyone contributing to build these very important maps for our modern society. The last trend I want to talk about is autonomous. Now, you've heard about autonomous cars, but what we want to discuss is autonomous farms, autonomous mines, and autonomous traffic. And one interesting idea would be to combine the Uber app with autonomous cars. We have 800 million cars on this planet today, and the fact is they're used less than 10% of the time throughout a day. So we could actually do with maybe 80 million vehicles instead of 800. That's a huge difference when it comes to the traffic situation in the large megacities that we're building, and just being able to move about in large city centers. So I think this is going to be probably the most interesting development that our generation is going to see over the next 30, 20 years. Autonomous things. So when we stand here today in 2015, it's fair to say we've come a long way, and we have a lot to do in the next 10 years to develop even better technologies. But as a starting point is good. And I think this is a good time to reflect over the past 30 years, which is roughly the time span for the modern IT development. And we've invited a man to share with us today how it all started. And it started back in 1985, when the fax machine was still cool.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Doug Menuez.
Thank you so much, Ola, and the entire Hexagon team who worked so hard to put this together, and to all of you for having me here tonight. I'm delighted to be here. And I just heard those simple rules for Vegas. I just want to see a show of hands. How many of you have already broken those simple rules? Because I love iconoclasts and rule breakers personally, as you will find out. Before we go back to 1985, way back, I want to give you a sense of my background as a photographer. I've had an incredible ride, an incredible career. I've been truly blessed. I actually got to step foot on the North Pole when it was still frozen. I've crossed the Sahara. I explored the Amazon and ran into an abandoned leper colony with 30,000 lepers living by themselves. I covered the homeless crisis from the beginning, the drug wars, the AIDS crisis in America, lots of different news stories, including 9/11. I photographed Presidents Bush and Clinton and lots of celebrities, a lot of movie stars like Cate Blanchett, Hugh Jackman, and many other cultural figures like Mother Teresa. My last book was on AIDS orphans in Uganda. 20 orphans support 700 by doing a dance tour. We raised 100 grand for these kids with the book so far. I've traveled millions of miles around the world in search of beauty and trying to communicate one culture to a wider audience. From Vietnam and China, to Russia, Europe, Dubai, Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Brazil. I've been all over. Almost everywhere. Not quite yet. It's a big planet. But hundreds of thousands of miles a year for 30 years. I actually held Einstein's brain in my hand once. I had dinner with Stalin's daughter. There's a lot of stories, but none of that matters. Nothing in my career compares to in the 30 years to the electrifying chaos I was privileged to witness in Silicon Valley during the digital revolution, when a secretive tribe of brilliant engineers, entrepreneurs, and venture capitalists sparked an explosion of innovation that changed our world forever. They proved the power of creative ideas can become reality, given enough guts, willpower, and passion. They did use imagination and knowledge, as Ola pointed out. So I'm going to take you back to Silicon Valley during that simpler place in time, before the internet, before texting, before Facebook. It was the age of the beeper. Who remembers beepers? Of course, this is a global story now, but bear in mind, I'm taking you on to a tiny little place on the planet in California. It's a very local, valley-centric story that I'm going to share with you. And I went to Silicon Valley as an outsider, but my path there led through Africa first. In 1985, I was a young photojournalist covering the famine in Ethiopia and conflict in Eritrea for Newsweek. By this point, I'd seen my share of death and horror in the world, but honestly, I was completely unprepared for the sheer scale, the enormity of this human catastrophe. You'd walk into a camp and 100,000 people would be dying. It was unbelievable. And I struggled to find a way that I could communicate what was really happening. I wanted to be useful. On my return to the Bay Area, I began looking for a story that was more hopeful for the human race, something more positive, but I also wanted to find something that would be meaningful for my own life. That same year, Steve Jobs was forced out at Apple, and he announced he was going to build a supercomputer to transform education. That got my attention. I knew that was important. You know, from the height of fame and power, he was humiliated and forced down. And he was beginning to do this whole new project, but it was interesting because he changed the world twice already. He might do it again. The stakes were high. Through friends, I proposed this crazy idea that I'd be allowed to document Steve with his team building the next computer, that's what they called it, from inception to shipping. I wanted to understand his process of innovation and photograph that. And I wanted to do it with complete access, unrestricted access. And I wanted to do it for Life magazine. Believe it or not, Steve agreed to this crazy idea. Of course, being Steve, he already had the idea. I was just in the right place at the right time with the right idea. Because Steve trusted me, and he did trust me, everyone in the Valley did. And after 3 years with Steve, I spent 3 years there. I have the scars to show for it. But I went out into the Valley, I became obsessed with these people, and I went out into the Valley and I spent 15 years shooting 250,000 negs of almost every major innovator of the day, of this 15-year period. This work is being preserved at Stanford Library. They want to inspire the next generation of engineers and entrepreneurs through these stories and through the photographs. And through this preservation work, we've been able to bring you this book, Fearless Genius. We're trying to do a documentary now and a nonprofit for education. I'll be signing these books later at the pool when we're partying, for anybody that wants one. And the documentary is next. So I got a few stories I want to share with you. And I'm going to begin where I began, with Steve, the avatar for a new generation. Again, this was after he was fired from Apple. Everyone knows about the tremendous success Steve had in the last years of his life. Staggering. Very few people know about the almost tragic decade of struggle and failure that he went through, particularly anybody under the age of 30. He wanted to put the power of a giant mainframe the size of a refrigerator into a 1-foot cube. And this was 1985. Tough. But one day, the cube prototype arrived, and it was sitting on the table, and we were sort of all standing around looking at it, and I just off the cuff, I said to Steve, "Hey, Steve, what are you going to do with this thing anyway? What do you expect to accomplish?" And Steve wheeled on me, and he said, "I want some kid at Stanford to cure cancer in his dorm room." My head exploded, as he had this passion and this belief in his eyes that it was possible. But because Steve believed, he was such a powerful leader, his whole team believed. Everyone wanted to be on the bus to the future with him. This is the day Ross Perot came in with $20 million to fund Next. Steve started it with his own money, but he needed a lifeline. And he thought it would be cool to set up a formal lunch in the abandoned warehouse, where he told Ross that they would build the world's most advanced robotic assembly line. And they'd build 10,000 computers a month. It would have been the first smart factory. Ross fell in love and wrote the check for $20 million. This is the early days. The entire company's in this room. And Steve is saying, "Hey, everybody, I have an idea. Let's work nights and weekends till Christmas, and then we'll take a week off." And this engineer in the back of the room, this little guy, Andy, the last guy I would expect to speak up, "Steve, we already are working nights and weekends." Susan Kerr, in the middle there, she's affected millions of people's lives every day, including yours, because she designed the icons for the Macintosh in 1983. But then, even more importantly, Bill Gates had her redesign the Windows icon. IBM had her do OS/2, and she's done dozens of operating systems over the years. She's the queen of icons, and one of the many women who remain unsung heroes of Silicon Valley that I was fortunate enough to meet. Yes, into the mind of Steve Jobs. I feel so lucky that I got to shoot these artifacts, because this is a Steve Jobs to-do list. Not a great picture, but it's his brain. I like the ankle-deep shit at the bottom. Those are tough technical problems they were working on. Never try to do a new product with 6 or 7 unproven new technologies in one box on a deadline, by the way. But despite all I'd been through in my career at that point, which was quite a lot, around Steve, I found myself intimidated and actually terrified. He was only 2 years older, but I felt like a little kid. Even though he protected me, he gave me his blessing and access, I could see that someday he would turn to me and I'd have to justify who I was and what I was doing. I had to sort of look inward. I had to figure out really who I was and what I was doing there and what I believed in, just like everyone else at Next. Because everyone in that room had to be the best in the world, the top of their game. Photojournalists want to take pictures that could improve the world, bring light to injustice, maybe change the world. I was willing to die to make a picture like that, as all my colleagues are. But then I realized, oh my God, these are the people actually changing the world. All I have to do is shoot them, create a record of that, and that could be my purpose. That felt useful. And once I had that figured out, Steve became a lot easier for me to handle. This is Dan Lewin, one of my heroes and the vice president of Next. Steve had just walked up to them at an offsite. He's doing sales and marketing. And he walked up to him and he said, "I need a plan to sell $1 billion worth of computers a year, and I need you to write it in 20 minutes and present it to the company." And he did it. They never sold that much. He was complicated. There's a ton of cliches around Steve, but he was layered. He wasn't either a genius or a complete jerk. He was complicated. He could be incredibly charming, sensitive, and joyful at times. He wrestled with his demons, but he worked on it. And I call this Steve Jobs pretending to be human. Seriously. He was never, ever, ever, ever off. He never, ever relaxed. He's pretending to relax to try to get the team to relax. This is a very, very rare set of pictures. This is what I was after, is him, just a simple process of working with this engineer, dealing with the coding that they want to put on this cube. The main thing I learned watching him was that it was all about trust. He had to know that person who was presenting an idea had done their homework and completely believed in their idea. Any decision he made could potentially risk the company. It was a startup. And he knew that. And he didn't want to fail. If he didn't like what they presented, if he didn't believe in it, or if he didn't think that person was really was standing behind the idea, he could explode. He would start screaming, "This is stupid. This is the stupidest idea I've ever seen." It was a little more colorful than that. And right in your face. But if that person was evolved as a human being, and they had done their homework, and they believed in their idea, they would just calmly say, "No, Steve, screw you. It's not stupid. It's a good idea." "This is stupid." "No, it's not. This is stupid." This would go back and forth, maybe 5 minutes. Could go on for 20. And then suddenly, a switch would flip in Steve's brain, and he would just get it. And then he would smile, that beautiful smile, and he would just go, "Great," and turn to the next victim. I'm not excusing bad behavior, but somehow he got these brilliant people, the best in the world, to rise above their own prodigious talents and create impossible stuff. This is a rough clip of Susan Rockrise. She was very close to Steve. She was a creative director there. This is her take from the documentary we're working on. And this is her talking about her thing about how she feels about trust with Steve.
Well, I have another theory about trust with Steve, and that is that in my own reading and learning about human behavior and interaction with people, I have a phrase that sort of says, hurt people hurt people. And so Steve, for me, as an orphan from his living parents, separated from his biological sister, starts a company, needs to find a way to communicate his emotion, creates machines that are able to be utilized by mere mortals, that are not about communicating about numbers and spreadsheets, they're about communicating the senses and the artistic truth of the individual. It's almost as if these people have a chance to scream their truth through these amazingly easy to use tools based on some need inside of him to tell the truth emotionally that somehow he may have gotten to before he died, I don't know. He gets to Apple and he hires somebody based on what he believes is the right thing to do, which is John Sculley for consumer marketing reasons. He wants somebody to help him break through. So technology from Apple's not just technology. And then, boom, he gets outed by the man he hires from the company he found. So that's two orphan experiences. One from his biological family and one from his own company. So by that time, at less than 40 years of age, there's no way in the world that man's going to trust easily.
What I love about listening to Susan and her very articulate comments is that for me, it's really not about technology, this whole story. It's about the human being, and it's about what is worth doing with your life. So I'm going to jump ahead. This is the spring of 1989, and Steve has burned through millions and millions of dollars. He's almost out of money. He almost has to shut the company down. He's managed to finagle a meeting with the chairman of Canon, and he's hoping to get an investment of $100 million, but he has heard through the grapevine or through back channels that they really only want to give him $50 million for twice the amount of stock. So he began the meeting by making a series of 6 ridiculous demands unrelated to the agenda, and everybody was mystified, one after the other. It took about an hour for him to lay these things out, and Cannon got more and more upset. Finally, the chairman goes, "I need a break." He leaves the room. Steve turns to his team and he says, "You guys have screwed up this deal," and he runs out of the room. And they're looking at me, and I'm looking at them, and like, what just happened? Nobody knows. But a little while later, Steve comes back in. And he begins unwinding these demands as Canon is aggressively confronting Steve and fighting him one by one. Slowly but surely, they finally, after another hour, they've defeated the great Steve Jobs on every point. Yay! But in that instant, the power shifted right back across the table to Steve. It was like jujitsu. They were going to lose face. They had to throw Steve a bone. Somehow he got the $100 million, plus he got their robots that he had promised Ross Perot 2.5 years before. And secrecy was paramount. This is right before the launch, even in those days, especially then. So after years of backbreaking work, in 1988, they had a fantastic launch. Steve had 80 magazine covers around the world. The crowd and the press were blown away by this. Nobody knew it was a barely functioning prototype with the Sun workstation running backstage. And when they finally did ship, they were too late. And they were way overpriced for their higher ed market. And they had incredible stuff. The elegant operating system was 10 years ahead of its time. The hardware eventually failed. Steve had to shut the company down. And except for the World Wide Web was actually invented on the next computer. I don't know if you guys know that, Tim Berners-Lee. But the hardware failed. But he never gave up on the software. He kept developing, next step, thus sowing the seeds of his future redemption. Because Apple then bought that operating system in 1996, and he got back on the board and then took the company over. And it's that operating system, I think most of you know, is the basis for the operating system today. The operating system that's running all of Apple's products originated with the next operating system written in the 80s. He was far from perfect, but he was the most inspiring person I ever met. After Steve, I went over to the calm oasis called Adobe, where I heard they were working on this cool thing called Photoshop. What? Why would I want to do digital photography? This was all shot on film, don't forget. Before Adobe, you had 500 years of printing technology based on the Gutenberg press and incremental improvements until one day, these guys, Chuck Geschke and John Warnock, spent 20,000 man-hours writing code that allowed computers to speak to printers. It was a really hard problem. And suddenly you had PostScript, and this explosive desktop publishing revolution was born. Oh, this is symbolic. These are engineers, and if they were going to have sex, this is, I think, how they would do it. This is funny, kind of, but really for me, the subtext was, how dare you go on vacation right now at this time? The great painter David Hockney is learning Photoshop here. This is the first Photoshop Invitational. Great artists, musicians, all kinds of cultural people were flooding into the valley to understand how these tools could improve their art. And it became a cultural crossroads. It was kind of like what Paris in the 20s must have been. It was really cool. So I felt like a visual anthropologist. I felt I was discovering a hidden tribe. They were inventing their own language and a new culture to go with the technology as they went. And they had this power to change everything. They ended up changing the very nature of work through their culture. So after Adobe, I was invited in to document the Apple Newton project, where they were building a handheld communications and computing device. And John Sculley gave me permission to do exactly what I had done with Steve Jobs. So it was very interesting, very Shakespearean. And John asked me, well, are you going to reveal our mistakes? And I had that moment where I was like the mayor of Toronto. Yes. And he said, okay, maybe we'll learn something from that. Great, go ahead. So I got complete access to document at Apple, in the design lab, everywhere. And even though they were the most profitable computer company in the world then in 90, 91, 92, which none of you knew, they really were more than Compaq, more than IBM, more than anybody, more than Dell. But they were losing market share hand over fist, and they were having a hard time writing their new OS, so they couldn't innovate. So John began looking for a new revenue stream. And he found a rebel unit inside the company called Newton, and he funded them. He was often criticized for forcing Steve out, and he got a bad rap for not being a tech guy, for being a marketing guy. Yet, after Steve left the company, John grew the company from $800 million to $8 billion a year. There's a lot of stories that you don't know about John that deserve to be told. He's a very humble guy. This is Steve Capps. This guy has he has influenced the last 30 years of interface design. He helped create the Finder for the Mac. And here he is working at home, not on the OS, but behind him is the computer where he's writing the OS for the Newton. And he decided he couldn't do that at work, and they were trying to foster creativity, so they said, sure, you can work at home. That was kind of new then. And this is Wozniak, of course, the genius behind the Apple and the Apple II, which he doesn't really get the credit he should for launching the personal computer industry. So Apple under Sculley did something else. They started pushing to have more diversity, more diverse engineers and managers, and he hired a lot of women, which I didn't see a lot in Silicon Valley in those days, as I would walk through the labs. And this is Sarah Clark, one of the engineers, and she had her baby. I never saw her leave the building. She would sleep while her code was compiling and breastfeed behind a blanket in her cube. And this is in the war room. And it raises the issue for me of why diversity matters. Is it social justice? Of course. Is it because all the companies that we know of in the US that have more women on their boards are more profitable? Yes. But really, for me, it's even as a user, it comes down to whoever writes the code controls the machine, which impacts your behavior and the wider culture. The worldview of the person writing the code matters to us as users. And I learned that as a beta tester, by the way. So a few years in, the team was getting exhausted. The Newton team only had 30 people writing 1 million lines of code. Compare that to Windows NT, where they had 400 people writing a similar amount over 4 years. But the Newton team finished this in a year. Then Apple decided, for good reason, to change the chip. And they announced to the team, you have to rewrite all that code, the whole 1 million lines. We'll give you 1 more year. And this young engineer, Ko Usono, had just gotten married. He was 27. And this was right before Christmas when this happened, and he heard about it. He went home, he loaded a pistol, and he shot himself in the heart. And which was just devastating for the team, for all of us. It was unbelievable. But these people had heart, they had passion, and they got together, and they rallied, and they worked through Christmas, and they dedicated it to Ko. There's a dedication hidden inside the OS. And they made the launch date. It was an emotional catharsis and a triumph for the team. They shipped it too early, though, and the Newton ultimately failed. It wasn't ready. John Sculley was forced out as CEO for a number of reasons right after that. But John's vision was vindicated. The Newton paved the way for the Palm Pilot, for the iPad, the iPhone, and a whole world of smart devices. And if you don't believe me, see me later at the pool, and I'll give you evidence. So without the investors, you don't get the technology. And without really smart, creative, patient investors, you don't get the really big change-the-world breakthroughs. And if you were a young entrepreneur, this was the hottest room in town to do your elevator pitch. This is John Doerr and Kleiner Perkins in their famous Monday morning meeting. Very, very tough room to get into. These guys were amazing. They had an incredible run in the 80s and 90s and the 70s with Genentech, but they did Sun and Compaq, AOL. Later they did Netscape. They did At Home, maybe a little company you heard of called Google, and Twitter, and on and on and on. And they were patient investors. They did Amazon, and Amazon didn't make a profit for 5 years. They were patient. I'll come back to this point later. This is one of the true fearless geniuses. Bill Joy, co-founder of Sun, wrote Berkeley Unix when he was like 5 years old or something. Anyway, here he is explaining the internet. In 1992, there's this thing, it's the internet, and that's William Randolph Hearst III. By 95, when Bill Clinton came to Silicon Valley on a fundraising tour, he stopped by to see John Doerr and 10 of the titans of Silicon Valley. He understood the economy had shifted from manufacturing to information. It had gone from the middle of the country out to Silicon Valley. So young companies were rising faster than ever before. You saw companies get to $1 billion in revenue before that had ever happened in history. And these new giants were rising up, like Microsoft, to disrupt the old giants. In this section here, I want to show you a selection of pictures that are some of my favorites. This is just like a scrapbook of pictures during the 15 years from some of the 70 companies I shot. I want to give you a flavor of the day in the life inside this world. This happens to be Bill Gates, and he happens to be saying at TED, no one should ever pay more than $50 for a photo with digital technology. It's like, what? Thanks, Bill. Luckily, that hasn't come true. This is Intel's most advanced fabrication plant in the 90s. They're building the Pentium chip, and most of these people are Pueblo Indians taking an exercise break. These are the original geeks. These guys are working at Beckman Instruments. They were fighting tooth and nail with HP for about 1 million years, going back to the 1930s. So what do you think one of the world's greatest thinkers and creative minds looks like when he's at work? This is Ed Catmull of Pixar. And this is when they were just finishing Toy Story, which then went on to change the entire entertainment industry. And Ed was one of the true, brilliant, most creative leaders, is still there, and wrote a great book recently. And Steve Jobs was there to buy Pixar and put his whole savings into it to keep it alive until Toy Story came out. Growth at Sun was so rapid that they were moving every few months. And for me as a photographer, by the way, it's really hard to shoot people at computers. Most of my friends thought I was an idiot doing this story. It's like nothing happens. People are thinking. But when I would see something like this, where someone would physically show you how they felt, I would run across the room to try to get it. And this is another emotional picture. This is a very disturbing picture to me. It's kind of like the lawsuit picture of sexual harassment where, I mean, the Valley was extremely sexist then. Very, very competitive. Women had to fight for every inch. And by the way, nothing has changed. It's still tough. I think the women are tougher now. Oh, Bill Joy again. This is, of course, Mannequin Piss, commemorating a battle victory for the Belgians in the Middle Ages, I think. But in this case, it's presiding over a massive water fight where 10,000 Sun employees are having a very, very intense battle down below, a very long staged battle. This map is not strategic. This is actually the golf courses that Scott McNeely, the CEO, wants to play. I just love this whole story. So the last story I'm going to share with you today, this company I photographed for quite a few years, 5 or 6 years. It's called NetObjects, led by Samira Arora, a very successful serial entrepreneur, still there with a new company. They are important because they capitalized on the early web and brought out the first software that would let any idiot create their own web page. So this leveraged creativity of millions of people. And they were successful. They led the market for a while. And this is what engineers eat when